Okay, I believe we're ready to begin. We're now live. Um, Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, friends of Moment Magazine, to this Facebook Live briefing um, related to my article that's in the September-October issue of the magazine. And here I should say my name is Liam Hoare, and I'm the Europe editor for Moment Magazine. And my article in the last issue was about the house in which Adolf Hitler was born and the plan by the Austrian government to turn that house into a police station. And so I thought I would talk for probably around 10 minutes, partially about the history of the house, just to give you some background about what the house has happened to the house in the past century or so, and then to discuss the contemporary debate surrounding this plan for the house, as I say, to convert it into a police station, because suffice to say, it's extremely controversial. So, best to begin, as I say, with the history. So, it was in April 1889 that Adolf Hitler was born in a room in this house in Braunau am Inn. Um, his Braunau am Inn is a border town on the Austrian-German border, and the family lived there because Adolf Hitler's father was a customs officer. They lived in this house for around 3 weeks. The family then sort of bounced around the town, and when Hitler was 3, they moved to Passau, which is sort of eastward up the river on the German-Austrian side of the border. So really, Hitler, as I say, didn't live there very long, and had very few memories of the house and of the town. And this meant that when Austria became part of the Greater German Reich in 1938, Hitler was opposed to the idea of turning the house into a museum or a shrine or anything like that. So what the Nazi Party ended up doing when they bought the house in 1938 was they converted it into a kind of a cultural center. So there was like a library, there was an art gallery, and this lasted, of course, as long as the Thousand Year Reich did, so until 1945. And it was, and then it's sort of after 1945 in a way that the kind of the saga begins, because in 1954 the house is restituted to the original owners, the Palmer family. And it was then that the authorities in Braunau and at the federal level became very concerned about what would happen to the house. Once the house is in private hands, anything can happen to it. They could sell it to someone who wants to turn it into a museum, to someone who wants to turn it into a shrine, to people who have nefarious intents, basically. And so the city and the federal government in the 60s became they took up the lease, essentially, on the house. And thereafter, the house had various purposes. The longest lasting one started in 1977 when the charity Lebenshilfe moved into the building. And that's a charity that works with people with disabilities, running workshops and so on. And this kind of a status quo persisted for decades until 2011. And having used the house for many decades, this house was built in roughly 1750, the original structure. It's obviously not fit to be used by people with disabilities. It's not accessible. So they wanted to make changes, including installing an elevator. And the owners of the house, the Palmer family, or the descendant thereof, said no, basically. And so Lebenshilfe moved out. And this meant that the city and the federal government, who by this point were paying, I think I'm right in saying, around $5,500 a month to lease this house, were left paying the rent on an empty house. And this forced the issue, again, to the fore, this question of, well, how are we going to control the house and how are we going to make sure that the house doesn't fall into the hands of nefarious people. So after much the discussion and slow consultation. In 2016, the federal government decided to requisition the house from the Palmer family. And this procedure took 3 years, and it ended with the Palmers being awarded a very handsome, I would say, $900,000 for the house. And then, of course, once you own the house, the question becomes, well, what does the government do with the house? And these discussions have been ongoing concurrent to this requisition proceeding, and so consultations with historians and other historical experts. And they basically recommended that the house not become a museum, for reasons I can perhaps go into later if I have time, but instead it should have either an educative or sort of socially oriented use, as it did when the charity Lebenshilfe used it, or an administrative and bureaucratic use. And that's what the government has ended up obviously deciding to do by having the police moved in. And this was decided on at the end of last year, and then it was in June, which is sort of when the sort of starting point for my article, if you like, when sort of the plans were released for the house of what it will look like. I should say to those people who have just tuned in to this Moment Magazine Facebook Live briefing that you can also leave your questions and comments in the comments. And if you have any questions, I will answer them once I've sort of finished my initial briefing. So that's the history of the building. And so the other thing is then, of course, to discuss what are these sort of contemporary debates about this plan to convert the house in which Adolf Hitler was born into a police station. And to be clear about what I mean by that, the original house, this sort of house from 1750, will be a functioning police station with interrogation rooms and identification rooms and whatever else you have in a police station. And then new buildings will be built out the back, sort of in keeping with the existing style, housing the police's regional bureaucracy and the other kind of paraphernalia that you need to run a police force, including places to park their bicycles and whatnot. So really, I think the contention about these plans for the house revolves around 3 areas. The first is the very concept of neutralization, which is this word that the Austrian interior minister used when he unveiled these plans for the house back in June. If you accept the idea that the house can't be torn down for all kinds of reasons, including very simple sort of town planning reasons, it's not good to have like a hole in the middle of your town, then something has to be done with it, and the government wants it to be quote-unquote neutralized, which is to say made bland and made sure in some way that it doesn't attract the attention of neo-Nazis and other far-right extremists and Hitler appreciators and so on. And to the people in Braunau who I interviewed for this piece, they basically think that this idea is a complete nonsense, principally because that fundamentally you can turn the house into whatever you want. It can be a police station, it can be a Wendy's, it can be whatever. But you can't change the basic fact that Adolf Hitler was born in 1889 in a room in this house in this town. And the relationship between Hitler on the one hand and Braunau on the other is inseparable. And so whatever one does with the house, yes, perhaps having the police in that location may deter people from going there for the simple reason that the police have the power to arrest you. It's still going to attract, as the town does now, people who want to come and see the house, who want to photograph it, who want to have their own picture taken in front of it, and things like that. There's nothing you can do. The second thing concerns basically the premise of having the police there in general. I should say here that, there's been obviously protests and much discussion in the United States and in the UK over the past many months about police brutality and discrimination and racism, institutional racism in the police force. But really, the background to the discussion in Austria has been its own, and Germany too, has been its own historical context, which is to say, fascism in the 20th century and Stalinism in the 20th century. So when Austrians and Germans discuss the police, they discuss it with reference to the Gestapo on the one hand and the Stasi on the other. So the Interior Minister's or Ministry's position is that the police are the ideal tenants for this building because the police represent the antithesis, I'm sort of paraphrasing, of everything that Hitler stood for. So the police are the guardians of our liberty and the protectors of our democracy and of human rights and so on. But to, on the one hand, we know that the police in Austria is a conservative institution and has a problem with far-right elements in the force. This is a known fact. Also, as one sort of German columnist said about this, yes, the police, when it functions properly, can be the guarantors of our liberty, but the police also functions within a police state, or it can do, as the Gestapo and the Stasi did. So this has given rise to a kind of counter-proposal in which basically the idea is that instead of being a police station, the building could be a national training center in Austria, so the police can be educated in anti-racism training and issues like democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And so the third thing, and will try and be brief, is that is the idea of, in front of the house, there is currently a memorial stone. And the stone was put there in 1989. The stone actually comes from the quarries of Mauthausen. And the stone has a, I would say, general anti-fascist inscription, which can be basically summarized as never again. And it was put there and its function is, on the one hand, a marker that this is the house, even though it doesn't say that. It's quite clear that's what it is. And on the other hand, it's a sign of the town of Braunau am Inn's own coming to terms with its relationship with Hitler. And the problem is that the initial plans for the house, made up by the federal government, didn't include the stone. It was gone. And then there were these counter-proposals, the idea that the stone could be dug up and moved to a museum in Vienna. The stone could be dug up and moved to somewhere else in Braunau. The stone could have its transcription rewritten so it was clearer, or had basically acknowledged the fact that of Austrian complicity in the Holocaust. And Braunau said no, because the federal government doesn't have the right to do that anyway. And of course, this basically is an old story in a way. It's about the tug of war between the federal government and the city government, and they want to do one thing and they want to do the other. And the city of Braunau has complained that the federal government has not consulted with them about what should become of the house, and has not taken into account their own wishes, including that the house be returned to its old sort of charitable use. And so that's one thing that has yet to be resolved. The city has said it's going to remain there. And so that will have to be in some way incorporated into this whole neutralization concept. So that's sort of the summary of my briefing, if you like. If you have questions, if you have comments, you can leave them in the comments. I don't see any at this second, so I will take the sort of final 5 minutes. Oh, now I see one. Are there any lessons America can learn regarding its problematic sites from the debate over this house? That's an interesting question, and I say that only because I think this first of all, there are different historical contexts, right? So we're talking about, as I said, we're talking about the police. In Austria, we're talking about the Nazi past and about also the experiences of dictatorships in Europe in the 20th century. It's also different because in the United States, what we're talking about are people who, as I understand it, in sort of after the Civil War, if we're discussing Confederate monuments, decided, as part of a political campaign, to put up these statues of Confederate generals or rename things after Confederate generals and so on. This house is in many ways a kind of accident of history. It just so happens that Adolf Hitler was born in this house at this time in Braunau am Inn. And so it's a sort of unfortunate relic that in some way has to be dealt with and it can't just be left sitting there. And also to that extent, as I said earlier, it can't really be torn down because it would just leave a kind of ugly hole in the middle of this town. So what I would say just quickly is that I don't know that it's a good comparison to make. Perhaps the only thing that they can learn is that unfortunately these things take a long time to actually sort of discuss, if you will. Which is to say that deciding what has going to become of the Hitler-Haus, this debate took place over about 70 years, or 60 years. And only now it's coming to a resolution. So perhaps the lesson here is that tearing these statues down right away may not be the best thing to do, and as boring as it seems, having a consultation about it and having historians discuss the issue in some public forum is necessary in terms of how best to deal with these monuments. There's another question, which is also a good question, which is why isn't this house a good location for a museum when places like Auschwitz and the Anne Frank house are? Well, the problem here, and this is something I discussed with historians when writing this article, is that in Austria for many, many decades, there was obviously the original sin of the Second Republic, if you like, was this myth that Austrians were the first victims of National Socialism. I'm sure you've all heard this idea. And part of that was the way in which the past was talked about was with reference to this time period, the Nazi period, being the Hitler dictatorship, or the Hitler state, or the Hitler regime. And what that did is it funneled all the blame for the Holocaust onto one man. When we now understand much better that the Holocaust could not have taken place without a functioning and complicit civil service, and judiciary, and police, and military, and lots of willing accomplices, basically. And so when we talk about sort of historical study and making museums and memorials and so on, since I would say the mid-80s in Austria, around the time of the Waldheim affair, historians are much more looking into the role of the police and these other institutions and the role of individual Austrians. And at the political level, this idea of sort of there is a Austrian collective guilt and Austrian co-responsibility for the Holocaust. And so if you were to take this house and put a museum in there, or if you were to take this house and do as has been proposed by one particular campaigner in Austria, a very vocal campaigner, and make it into a kind of site where young people from around the world would come and learn about democracy and human rights and so on. What you're doing in that case is, to quote someone in my article, reinforcing the Hitler myth. I.e., you're not doing it deliberately necessarily, but whatever museum you put in that house is going to reinforce the idea that Hitler was absolutely pivotal and the main reason why, or is entirely responsible for the Holocaust or the crimes of the Nazi period. When what contemporary historians want to do is focus much more on collective responsibility of the Austrian people and the responsibility of different Austrian institutions like the police and civil service and judiciary and so on. This is why, historians now, they want the Holocaust to be commemorized in more appropriate places, as it were, concentration camps, specifically designed museums like the one, say, in Washington, D.C., that actually fully accounts for how we got to Auschwitz, in a sense. or there's been a whole new wave of memorial construction here in Austria, of new Holocaust memorials, including this wall of names that's just about to be built and will be open next year or the year after. The Hitler-Haus is not the place to remember the Holocaust because it misleads people back to this old idea that Hitler is entirely responsible for it, when we must take into account the role of the Austrian people and other institutions. I've just about, I think, maxed out my time, so I want to use this opportunity to thank you for tuning in, and also to say that my article and all the other, well, some of the other articles in this issue, all of them are in print, and you can subscribe to the magazine by going to momentmag.com, momentmag.com. And if you go there, at least my particular article is also online if you care to read it. Of course, I also would stress that a subscription is very reasonably priced and makes a wonderful gift. So thank you very much.